Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions and Dragons, the show where we discuss Dungeons and Dragons. I am your host, resident player character, and with me today is our resident dungeon master. Today, we will be discussing an extremely important mechanic of the game, spellcasting. But first, how are you today, resident dungeon master?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing fine. So, today's episode is spellcasting. Before last episode, we went over classes, or not classes, races, and classes will most likely be our next episode. So, we made the decision, instead of going straight into classes, we are going to talk about the aspect of spellcasting in the game, which is something that at least half of the classes, right, use.
Yes, spellcasting is such an important part of the game Dungeons and Dragons, and not just for story and whatnot, but for the actual numbers of the game, the mechanics, if you will.
So there are, out of the 12 classes that we're going to be discussing, there are how many spellcasters?
Innately, just with the base class, I believe there are 8 total.
All right, and what are those 8?
We have bards, clerics, druids, paladins, rangers, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards.
So which one of those should we start with? Just go alphabetical?
Yeah, the bard is a spellcaster. They use music and musical instruments for their spells. Clerics have their spellcasting bestowed upon them from a divine being for story. Druids use the power of nature. Paladins are like clerics, but just a little bit different, still using that divine power. Rangers are a little bit like druids, but some different abilities, still with nature magic. Sorcerers get their powers from either their bloodline or just something other than learning. Warlocks get their magic from signing a pact with a demon or a very powerful being, and wizards just get their powers through years of study.
And we will go much more in depth in these classes in the next episode, so that was just a basic overview of what they are. So when we refer to them, you know what we're talking about. So my first question is, what is a spell in this game?
Spells are just magical effects that a player, monsters, non-player characters, just anything that can create. It is something that takes a specific amount of time, materials, and knowledge to cast.
What are some examples of spells in the game that you can give me?
We have utility spells, weapons and healing. A very good one is Cure Wounds. It's something you can get very early on. It helps heal party members. Very good.
Okay, and is there a chart for like the specific differences in the power of spells?
Oh, for sure. The chart ranges from levels 1 to 9 officially, where 1 being the weakest level of spells. These are usually things that don't do a lot of damage or healing or have an enormous sensory effect, but they're still useful. And on the other end of the scale, level 9 spells can completely flip a campaign on its head. I'm talking about a spell that calls down meteors.
What's that spell called again?
Meteor Swarm, I believe.
Yeah, that is. I've encountered that spell in a campaign or two myself, and it is not a fun thing to be at the butt of. Would you say that?
Yes, very, very powerful.
So, for a being to possess that kind of power, they have to learn it, right?
Oh, for sure.
How does a spellcaster learn and or know their spells?
So, kind of drawing back to the classes, Bard Cleric, Druid, Paladin, Ranger, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard, each class has their own specific, tailored way of obtaining their spells and having a certain amount prepared each day, because you just can't have all of the knowledge in the world at your fingertips. That wouldn't be very fair. So, I wish it was. Wizards are the closest thing to that because they just have such a broad list to learn from, but in a nutshell, at the beginning of each D&D day, or at the end of a long rest, when you've replenished all of your health and recharges, as you will, you'll get to choose which spells you'll have in the back of your mind, like on the back burner, for, oh, I'm in combat, what spell is the first thing I think of? And you have this small little list chosen from your repertoire.
And this is at the beginning of each day.
Yes, and usually in a D&D day, you'll wake up, you'll have maybe a short rest or two, and then at the end of the day when it's getting to be nighttime, or you've had just an arduous day of fighting or questing or puzzle solving, you'll take what's called a long rest, and you'll replenish all of your health and all of your magical energy.
That, to me, is one of the best aspects of the game in general. Like the ability to recharge what you have and to use it again. Like when I was being
I
first
like
introduced to the game, that was something that really stuck with me, something that I would like long term.
I For the long rest aspect of Dungeons and Dragons, I thoroughly enjoy it because it's a time for your character to how do I say this? It's a time to reflect and learn upon your experiences from the day. Gives you experience and literal experience points as the character, and the way I view it, just in as a dungeon master, there's just an innate magical energy flowing through the world that when you take a long rest or you just take a second and sit down and relax and just enjoy the energy, you'll heal yourself and you'll feel replenished.
This is all in the game for anyone who's just tuning in back into this conversation now.
Yes.
This isn't any kind of like energy crystal thing in real life.
It's no mumbo jumbo.
Yeah. No malarkey here. We're going to talk about nerd games. So, there are spells that I do understand that don't take up spell slots, as you were explaining.
Mm.
Now, can you quickly define what a spell slot exactly is in like mechanical terms?
And just at its core, layman's terms, a spell slot is an allowance. At the beginning of each day or at the end of a long rest, you have a certain number of spell slots, and I just like to think of them as opportunities to use your spell. So you have your allowance of all of this magical energy per long rest, and you can dish it out to each spell that you would like to do. And you can cast the same spell more than one time in a day or during a long rest. It's completely up to you how you use your spell slots. But once you use a spell slot, you don't get it back until a certain magical effect restores it to you, or you take a long rest, or even a short rest in some circumstances.
And going back to what I was saying, there are spells that don't exhaust spell slots, and those are called cantrips.
Yes, cantrips are just some people call them the level 0. We mentioned the chart before, or the power level 1 through 9. Cantrips are level 0. They're
That does not mean
weaker.
they're less powerful, though, but they are
Oh, no.
less dangerous most of the time, but they are very, very useful spells.
On paper, and not to be punny here, but on paper, cantrips are the weakest of the weak, but in the correct situation, they can be more powerful than a level 3 or 4 spell.
We were just discussing last night for my character I'm designing for a campaign that we're playing soon. A list of cantrips that I have, or a couple cantrips that I have that could be used in very, like, very situations that it doesn't belong in, that it could still be very useful in. It's all a matter of being creative, because there are cantrips, like, what was the one we were talking about?
Prestidigitation and True Strike, I believe.
Yes. Well, more so prestidigitation. It's a long word. Look it up. I'm not going to spell it. I don't think I could have tried off the bat.
X, Y,
Yeah. W. So prestidigitation just allows you to do a bunch of stuff. Like, it's essentially little magic tricks. Some of them having lasting material effects. You can light or snuff out a small candle, a campfire. Just
torch.
Yeah, torch. Things that can catch on fire that are small and, like, built already.
You can put your fingers up in the air, make tiny little fireworks. You can make something have an illusory mark on it, like a red X or a green check mark, or even a small arrow pointing up or down.
Yes, or anything in between that you can imagine that your Dungeon Master lets you do. It's a very good cantrip, and specifically why I chose this one is that my character is of the Kenku race, which we discussed last episode, and he cannot speak normally because of a curse that went upon his people. So that is going to be my primary mode of communication for my party and everyone around me, just making little symbols and sensory things that they can look at. And usually, what is prestidigitation usually used for in this game?
It can. I've seen it be used to distract people, maybe to draw attention, because you can make a smell with prestidigitation. It's just essentially a harmless sensory effect. It doesn't deal damage. It doesn't do anything. It can be used to help explain something. It can be used to give an example. It can be used to distract. It can be used to make a small fire, or even snuff out a small fire before something happens. It's just a tiny little utility spell, and it can be very useful as if you are trying to be a utility caster or someone in the party that doesn't really rely on damage or healing. They're just trying to help everybody out in general. But I will say, my absolute favorite thing about cantrips, you can cast them as many times as you want in a day because they don't take up spell slots.
Yes, so specifically with that mechanic, prestidigitation becomes very useful. Let's say you're in a cave and your torch keeps going out. Whoever has that cantrip in your party can just keep relighting it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably 1,000 uses of that spell.
Maybe you see a fuse lit, and you say, "Oh no, I don't I don't want that fuse to continue to that barrel of gunpowder." You can snuff out that little spark with. I believe you should be able to snuff out the spark with prestidigitation because you can snuff out a small fire.
Or you can make a small gust of wind that moves the gunpowder so it doesn't keep lighting.
Exactly. Just something small. It doesn't have to be extremely. You don't have to have these big damaging effects or spectacular shows of power in D&T. It can be the small things too that make all the difference.
And let's say in that realm of that barrel of gunpowder again, you have the fuse. Maybe you lit it. Maybe it's a trap in a fake barrel of gunpowder, but you prestidigitate the smell of sulfur, so whoever is near you, you're trying to falsely threaten with that thing, gets scared.
Yes.
There's thousands of uses for it. If
virtually
you're using
limitless.
it for your spellcaster, definitely get that cantrip. It's just worth it.
I will suggest a wizard, a bard. Excuse me. Wizards and bards are definitely get prestidigitation.
Oh yeah. So we talked about all these different ways you can use a spell. What are different ways that you can cast a spell?
There's one more very specific thing that's in the base game of the player's handbook called ritual spells. Now, these spells are very specific in the way that they have a lot of requirements to be cast as a ritual. Now, any spell can be cast as a ritual, but you have to meet the prerequisites of taking a feat or specific training to be able to do this, or your class allows it.
So, give me an example of a ritual spell, just so we know what we're dealing with.
The most iconic would probably be Tiny Hut. Tiny Hut is a spell that takes about a minute to cast, I believe. It should be a minute to cast, and at the end of the casting time, you create this hut, this small area of impenetrable force. So you have a force field around you, and it lasts for 8 hours, the time of a long rest. So if you think you're in a dangerous situation, you say, I really need to take a long rest. Take a minute, perform your little ritual, bam, Tiny Hut, you can get that long rest, get all your spell slots back.
Is it dome-shaped?
As a dungeon master, I really enjoy creativity. With something like this, it could appear as a small hut, but still have the area of a sphere. So when you look at it, you say, oh, that looks like a hut made of force, and you try to go and touch it or try to attack it, and it's just impenetrable.
So it's a force field, essentially.
It's a force field.
Yeah. That is pretty cool to me. I don't know if anybody else likes the cop-out of a force field, but it's always been well used in any media it's been used in.
That is, I believe, an 8th level spell. Just because an impenetrable barrier is very, very powerful.
Before we get into our second segment, which is kind of the mechanics behind these spells, I want to introduce and discuss some 9th level spells we could talk about for a couple minutes, because I think to understand fully the mechanics of the spells, we need an example where they matter. And I think 9th level spells are where the mechanics matter the most, or where they're debated the most, at least in my experience.
We could do an example of a first level spell, a fifth level spell, and a ninth level spell.
Go for it. You're the dungeon master. You choose them.
All right.
I trust you.
Starting with first level. We'll do. What's an iconic? We'll do Cure Wounds.
All right.
The clerics, paladins, and even druids can choose this spell at low levels, and it's a very good healing spell. The spell Cure Wounds, essentially, when you cast this, you touch a willing creature, and they heal for 1d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. Now, your spellcasting ability modifier, that's very, very mechanical. When we go into classes, it'll go more in depth with that. But essentially, each class has their own ability that they base off of. Bards and warlocks and paladins are charisma. Wizard is intelligence. Cleric and druid and ranger are wisdom. But more on that later. Essentially, it's just a little bit of health, and you could heal someone who's in grave danger.
So that's our first level.
Mm.
What is our fifth level?
Good example for a fifth level spell would be.
Also, we're choosing fifth level because first, fifth, and ninth are kind of like the check marks of power and spells. First level was like first level. Fifth level is like mid level, and ninth level is like the highest. If you're casting ninth level spells, you're basically a demigod in whatever universe you're in.
It's towards the end of the campaign. These are things that just in the campaign or win you the game outright.
Most of the time, you don't really get to them.
So a good fifth level spell I've seen used is Scrying. Scrying is an interesting spell because it allows you to spy on someone. And what happens is when you're casting this. Now, this is an example of a spell that takes a while to cast. It takes 10 minutes. A lot of materials that cost a lot of gold pieces in the game. But you have a tiny orb, and it goes and it follows a creature of your choosing, and there are like lots of little modifiers and whatnot. But let's say the spell succeeds and you successfully cast the spell. You know exactly what that creature is doing. You're spying on them as if you were right there with them.
If anybody has watched the Wizard of Oz, the original one, if you remember the witch's like crystal ball,
that's a perfect example of this.
Yeah, it's like essentially exactly that, where she was just spying on Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and the Lion when they were walking around, and she could see like an exact image of them.
So this small sensor appears within a few feet of the target, and it's invisible, and it can only be detected by magical means, and you just get to spy on somebody. And this thing lasts for how long? 10 minutes? Yeah, you could spy on someone for 10 minutes, maybe gaining some crucial information, maybe catching someone in the act of crime, lots of things.
So that's our fifth level.
That's a very good utility spell. It could be used in a lot of different circumstances, but coming out at the ninth level. There, we did discuss Meteor Swarm earlier, but a very, very iconic spell. Wish.
Don't do it.
Wish.
Oh, okay, good.
We're not going to talk about that other one. Probably not appropriate for the podcast.
Yeah.
Wish.
Might get to it.
Eventually, maybe a maybe a non-kid friendly version of D&D, actually getting into the more gruesome parts of it.
Yeah.
But never mind that now. Wish, ninth level spell, and I'm gonna quote this in just one specific
line.
Not line, but just paragraph or quote from the text. Alternatively, you can create one of the following effects of your choice. You can create one object of up to 25,000 gold pieces in value that isn't a magic item. You can create something like gems, gold, treasure, armor, doesn't matter. You can just create things. You allow up to 20 creatures that you can see regain all hit points, and you end all effects on them described in the Greater Restoration spell. You can instantly heal your entire party. You grant up to 10 creatures that you can see resistance to a damage type you choose. You could give them protection from fire or ice or acid. You grant up to 10 creatures you can see immunity to a single spell or other magical effect for 8 hours. That seems pretty amazing. You undo a single recent event by forcing a reroll of any roll made within the last round, including your last turn. Reality reshapes itself to accommodate the new result. For example, a wish spell could undo an opponent's successful save, a foe's critical hit, or a friend's failed save. You can force the reroll to be made with advantage or disadvantage, and you can choose whether to use the reroll or the original roll. You can change the course of events of a single important role, saying like this role, the entire balance of the world rests on if you make this save or not, or if you die or not, and you fail it, and then they die. You see your friend falling unconscious beside you, and you say, "I cast wish," and then they get a second chance.
For everyone thinking this, yes, this is exactly like the genie wish, except there's
Yes, this is a genie wish, and when a DM gives access to wish, there's always a twist.
always.
Always a twist. Now,
Usually not good.
there is a side effect already built into the spell. It says the stress of casting this spell to produce any effect other than duplicating another spell weakens you. After enduring that stress, each time you cast a spell until you finish a long rest, you take 1d10 necrotic damage per level of that spell. Essentially, you're using every ounce, every drop of magical energy inside you to cast this wish spell. It's so powerful that when you try to cast other magic afterwards, you're hurting yourself because you're trying to draw on a well that is dry.
It's like if you just like did a heavyweight championship of weightlifting and then you tried to go do an ab workout.
In addition, your strength drops to 3, and just on the list of ability scores, 3 is close to not being able to move at all. If it isn't 3 or lower already, for 2d4 days. So for 2 to 8 days, you basically can't even feed yourself. For each of those days that you spend resting and doing nothing more than light activity, your remaining recovery time decreases by 2 days, so faster recovery. Finally, there is a 33% chance that you are unable to cast Wish ever again if you suffer this stress. You have a 1 in 3 chance of never being able to cast this spell again, not just from your own repertoire, but ever again. The gods decree it so.
What this is exactly like, for anyone who watched Infinity War and Endgame Avengers, when Thanos / Bruce / Tony snap their fingers, that's exactly what this is.
You don't get another one. Well, I mean, it's a lot of stress, but yes. Mm-hmm. You can see the before and after of Banner Hulk's arm. That's the effects of this spell. It's
like the physical effects.
Power. It's so intense.
To say the least.
Yes, and it's amazing.
Would you argue that Wish is the most powerful 9th level spell?
Yes, because essentially of the effects that I personally listed off, those are just examples. You can do whatever you want.
It's up to the discretion of your DM which wishes come true and which don't.
No, because
like which you can cast.
Oh well, yeah, but hear me out. Anything you want happens, but you should be very specific in your wording. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm gonna say.
Also, genies exist in D&D.
Be careful what you wish for.
Is a thing that like you should be.
Oh, you can get this before. Yeah, you can get this before like 20th level or wherever you get your 9th level spells. You can get this at 3rd level. Mm-hmm. It's just there are items, magical items in the game that give you access to the wish spell, but there are always consequences to huge amounts of powerful magic like that.
I'd say the consequences of spells climb at a commensurate rate with the level of the spell.
Oh yeah.
There are some lower level spells that have self consequences.
Mm.
And in our second segment, we're going to talk about the methods to cast these spells, the components that you need, the ranges, the durations, the targets, the areas of effect, all that mechanical stuff.
The boring stuff.
I don't think it's boring, but yeah, kind of.
It's the math stuff.
Yeah. So get ready for a bunch of math. Here we go. Let's start with casting time.
Okay. So essentially, there are three different ways three main ways you can cast spells. For casting times, there's actions, bonus actions, reactions. Action is basically something you do on your turn or when you're in initiative. It takes roughly 6 seconds to perform a spell in this way, and action is just a unit of measurement for saying what you can do on your turn, and it kind of dictates how many spells you can cast in combat.
What is the difference between an action and a bonus action?
Bonus actions are generally a weaker type of spell. They don't do a lot more damage or have more utility, but it's just, if you can imagine an action of just like taking your full concentration to do this specific task for a few seconds, the bonus action is something that takes like, just a second, if not 2 seconds of thought just to perform. Maybe like, flicking a rock at somebody, or shouting, ow, ow, like when you stub your toe. Something like that.
And a reaction.
Reactions are actions taken on another person's turn when a stimuli, such as an opportunity attack, arises, or if you held your action, you could save it for somebody else's turn. They're just very specific actions, but nothing you can do on your turn in combat for reactions.
Okay, and there is a lot of talk in certain campaigns about what counts as a reaction, bonus action, or action, depending on the situation, sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. And not just with spells, I mean, all sorts of different actions, such as using an object, talking with somebody, making an attack. There are plenty of things you can do in D&D, just anything that your imagination can hold of your character doing. Say, hey, is this an action or a bonus action if it's not explicitly stated as an action or a bonus action already?
And you can prepare these ahead of time sometimes, right?
Yes. So when you are choosing your spells for the day, you can sort of craft a style you want to play in. Say, I want to save these spells for my actions, and I have a couple of these bonus action spells, so that'll be good. But I have this one really good one for a reaction in case something goes bad.
What I meant is you can prepare actions that aren't exactly spells.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Such as, let's say you are waiting behind a door, and you say to the DM, hey, I would like to hold my action, so if someone comes to the door, I use my action to trip them. And so when that circumstance happens, you attempt to trip the person. This can be used in a myriad of ways, and it's just overall useful for holding your action if you're trying to ambush someone.
It's like making a reservation to do a thing instead of showing up on the spot.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have to specifically say, I'm going to do this at this time. You could just continuously wait for 5, 10, 15 minutes, just waiting for one specific thing to happen if you so choose your character to do.
Mm-hmm. And that also plays into the components of whatever you're doing.
Oh, definitely. For spells, components, there are three main categories: verbal, somatic, and material, represented by V, S, and M when you're looking at a spell. Now, verbal, it's obvious. These are the magic words, as you would have it, of the spell. You mutter the magic words as part of the spell. There you go. Just abracadabra, alakazam, stuff like that. But it's its own little D&D speech that has been tailored to cast that specific spell.
And for somatic, for anyone who doesn't understand, because verbal and material kind of straightforward. For somatic, can you explain for people who might not understand that word or never heard of it before?
Do you remember the Doctor Strange movies? Or movies,
Yes.
sorry. When he wasn't speaking when he was casting these spells, he was moving his hands around. That's somatic. It is the hand movements that makes these magical effects kind of appear before the actual spell is cast. So some spells require verbal and somatic. You need to be able to speak things and move your hands around so that you make the effect. Some spells only require verbal. Some spells require all three. And the more powerful the spell, generally you need all three of these components.
Yeah, I see that a lot in spells that are higher level. You need all three of them. Usually the materials are for higher level spells at least, are very expensive or hard to find. So you might have
Mm.
a DM that just says ignore material components, or they might have like
Mhm.
a component pouch that you have at the beginning of the campaign that you just it's a kind of like a plot device that says you have all your components already or most of them.
Just ask your DM how they want to play it in their campaign. If they don't really care, it's all right. But if they do, it's always good to ask.
Yeah. And I'm sure if you had a DM that said you have to get the materials, they'd allow you to acquire those materials throughout just normal play.
Yeah, of course. I know for some of my players in campaign, if I required them to have material components for something, I would give them access to go and get those material components. Whether it's easy or not, depending on what they're trying to find, that's a whole nother story. But if I'm going to say, hey, you need this to do this, or this to do that, I'm going to give you access to this, so you can do that.
Yes. And we have also two different durations of spells, right?
Mm.
What are those?
Yes, the two categories are instantaneous and concentration. Now, when you're casting a spell, combat or not, the spell effect will be described to you under the spell text whenever you look up the spell. But generally, let's say you're casting an attack on someone, it's going to be an instantaneous effect, meaning when you finish casting the spell, or I say this with like air quotes, when you're finished with your few seconds of your action or even your bonus action, an instantaneous effect occurs, maybe like as fast as a bullet or like a bullet train, and just shoots out and then does whatever your spell wanted you to do. Like maybe shoot a small firebolt, maybe put someone to sleep. Doesn't matter. These things are instantaneous. If they say instantaneous under the spell, they happen immediately after you cast the spell on your turn.
We were talking
But
about prestidigitation earlier. That's
oh
instantaneous.
yeah. Let's see what else. Cure wounds, instantaneous.
Yeah, so there's a lot of instantaneous spells that have minor effects, but also some that have very major effects. Like, you may think that some higher level spells are mostly all concentration, but it's a pretty even split between low level and high level instantaneous concentration, where it's spread
Now,
all throughout.
now you might have a spell that requires you to focus for like 10 minutes to an hour to cast it, but it could be an instantaneous effect immediately after that timer is met.
Like Tiny Hut.
Oh yeah, of course. As soon as you finish casting that spell,
But
there's
how
your
long
tiny
does it
hut.
take to cast?
About a minute, I believe.
Yeah.
Now,
And
the other category, concentration.
oh yeah,
So concentration is a type of spell where you cast it and then it stays up for a duration as long as you hold concentration on the spell. Concentration is only broken when you cast a spell with another spell with concentration. You can cast other spells that aren't concentration while you have a concentration spell up. I'll be saying this word a lot. But you lose concentration when you get hit on an attack and fail a Constitution saving throw against the amount of damage. There are specific rules for this, but essentially you're trying really hard to focus on keeping your magical energy flowing into the spell, and there are some circumstances that say, okay, you're going to have trouble holding concentration on this because you just got punched in the kidney, or you just fell down a flight of stairs. It would kind of be hard to focus on playing your DS if you fell down a flight of stairs.
yeah. There are
So,
lots of concentration breakers in the game. Try your best to avoid them. I know I've fallen victim to a couple of them before.
oh, definitely.
Being a spellcaster is really about knowing your surroundings and knowing what could potentially interrupt you from casting a spell. Because spellcasters are a lot like the best way to describe them is just ranged in general. And range of spells is very important because ranged spells take time to get to their destination sometimes. So you got to position yourself in a specific area for specific spells and make sure you don't get hit for that
Oh,
spell
for
to
sure.
work properly.
And for range on spells, they can spells can range from touch spells to spells over a mile away.
Yeah.
And it really just depends. Mostly, you're going to be dealing with things that are within 30, 60, 120 feet. 60 is probably the most common number you'll see for spells.
Yeah.
But there are very powerful spells that say, hey, meteor swarm, mile away. You can just stand on a mountain and bring down the wrath of a moon onto the plane. Yeah, exactly. It's just
yeah.
yeah.
It's not fun.
I mean, it's a 9th level spell. You expect some crazy effects.
You use it once, and whatever goal you're trying to reach is pretty much met. With Cure Wounds is an example of a touch spell, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have to be touching whatever you're trying to cast it on, or whoever you're trying to cast it on for it to work.
Exactly.
Now, there's been a lot of talk between the two of us recently about a spell called Heroism, and uses that could have. That is a spell or a cantrip? I don't remember.
It is a spell, I believe, first level.
Yes. So
gives you temporary hit points and makes you immune to being frightened.
Yes, and there are a lot of uses for that. Besides just empowering teammates or yourself, you might be able to persuade someone to take on an enemy that's a little too powerful for them to get them out of your sight, per se.
You might be able to have someone who's scared for their life, like a non-player character. They say, I don't know what I'm going to do. I need help with this. You cast Heroism on them. They calm down. They have a clear state of mind. They say, I think it's going to be all right. Like, it definitely can be used in a role-playing setting.
Oh, yeah.
And I've seen it used before. Very, very effective. But it also has its own combat statistics for gaining health, or not health, but temporary hit points, and being immune to the frightened condition. Very, very helpful.
Now, something to touch on with combat spells, and sometimes utility spells, is the area of effect, or the AoE of them. In D&D, they exist in many different shapes and many different sizes. Could you explain some of those?
Oh yes, of course. There are 5 different ways a spell could be an area of effect. Usually it's either just centered on a point, like if you were to cast Firebolt and you say, I'm going to aim at that point, you point and shoot. And same thing goes for if you were to make an attack with like a sword or a bow and arrow, you say, I'm going to attack this thing or that point, whatever. Area of effect spells give you a specific range where it's just an area that is affected by your spell. These can include cones, cubes, cylinders, lines, and spheres. Now, lines are just, you can imagine, very small cylinders that just go in a very long position. And usually, for some of these spells that aren't area of effect, or some of them, but that aren't area of effect, such as, we keep bringing this up, Firebolt, you will need to have line of sight on your target. You can't just peek around a corner without being able to see them. So you can't just be hiding in a barrel and then all of a sudden a firebolt comes out.
And
then
if there's a
it
hole
knows
in the
exactly
barrel, which
where
they commonly are, you might be able to make something work there.
Exactly. So
Now,
I digress.
You have a spell, I think a really good way to kind of give an example of AoE, area of effect, for spells is Sleep. The spell
Sleep, yes. Another very good example is Fireball, but we'll start with Sleep. Sleep essentially is you point and cast at a certain area in space, and within a sphere, there is a set of dice you roll based on what level you cast Sleep or how powerful the Sleep spell is, and you, starting with the weakest creature, you start putting people to sleep magically, and there is a cap to this, and it's very, very useful as a utility spell. I very much enjoy using this spell as a wizard myself, but it says, hey, anything not in the sphere isn't affected. So, I mean, if you miss or you miscalculate, so be it. You've used your sleep spell. But if you catch someone in it, very powerful.
Yes, and you were going to talk about Fireball?
Fireball, another area of effect sphere. But essentially it just says, hey, you aim a tiny little flaming ball, cast it, and it hits it's a point within your range that you can see, and a fiery explosion erupts from it. And it only encompasses a certain sphere, and it can go around corners, and it engulfs people, and it does fire damage. And essentially, it's just this big explosion in this sphere centered on that one point. And creatures inside can make dexterity saving throws to see if they can get out of the way of the fire or take less damage. But in summary, it's just it only encompasses that sphere, and you could be 1 inch away from that sphere and not be affected at all. Not even get your hat blown off by the explosion.
Good luck with that happening, though.
Oh
Because
yeah,
usually the
of
person
course.
casting a spell like that is aiming towards you or near you.
If you're casting an area of effect spell, you're going to be very, very accurate with just placing that point exactly where you want to affect as many creatures as possible. I've seen it done in every session I've ever played in that we have a spellcaster.
Now, you mentioned saving throws, which is something literally almost every damaging spell has.
Yes, saving the throws are just a way for spellcasters to not be completely overpowered. Essentially, it gives their assailant a chance to not be affected by that spell either at all or as much, depending on the power of the spell or the type. So, like I was saying with Fireball, someone caught in the blast can make a dexterity saving throw, which basically means they roll a d20. They add the results to their dexterity saving throw modifier, and this can change between creatures and classes, but there's a lot more to talk about for that. And if they succeed on the saving throw, they take half damage from the fireball, or the damage rolled from the fireball by the wizard, or whatever spellcaster it is. But if they fail, they take the full damage, and they get caught in the explosion.
Yeah, that's not a fun time. I've seen it happen.
I've been on the butt end of a fireball too many times to get. That's one too many times.
And we also have we also have attack rolls, which are kind of like saving throws, but like
essentially it's just saying, hey, there's an armored guard over there, and I would like to aim this firebolt and try to get in the nick of his armor right there, because armor is not going to be perfect 100% of the time. You're going to have a chance to be hit with something. If you beat their armor class with your attack roll, that firebolt can just sail through and hit the right spot on their armor, or in between their armor, to deal that damage. If you miss your attack roll, it could glint off of the armor or miss entirely, whatever your DM decides to describe to you. But essentially, if it's not a saving throw that someone has to make, it's going to be an attack roll for you for damaging spells.
Yes, and we were also discussing yesterday combining magical effects.
Oh, of course. And it's not uncommon.
Combinations one can make.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for two magical effects to be happening at the same time, such as heroism on someone who is also being affected by the fly spell, where they can literally just command their body to go up, down, left, right, whatever direction they want flying. And so a good example of combining magical effects would be if you were a creative player and you said, hey, I would like to try to combine the effects of these two spells to make an even more powerful effect. There are two cantrips I believe we were talking about yesterday.
One of them was True Strike.
True Strike, yes. A very terrible cantrip in theory.
I don't think it's terrible. I think it's pretty good.
In theory, the community agrees on this, but we spent a couple of hours the other day trying to decipher a way to make this bad spell good. Now, it is a cantrip, very, very weak initially, and essentially with True Strike, you take a second when casting this spell and identify a weak point on your target. It gives you insight into the next attack roll you make on the next turn. Now,
did you say it gives you advantage?
It gives you insight, but yes, in mechanical terms, it gives you advantage on the next attack roll you make on the creature or character, however you may be. Anyways, when you get advantage on a roll, essentially, when you roll a d20 to try to hit something, you don't have advantage unless something says so. When you have advantage, you get to roll that d20 again and use the higher of the two numbers. This can statistically increase your odds of hitting something by, I believe it's 36% on average. So your odds go up if you have advantage.
Strike is very useful.
It can be, and any spell can be very, very powerful in the right circumstances. You as a player just have to find that sweet spot to use these spells in, and the DM needs to be appreciative enough for your creativity to allow you to do the effect. So continuing on, True Strike lets you get insight on a weakness that the enemy has. Our resident player character wanted to combine this effect with prestidigitation
Yes.
to make a small marking on the weak spot of the creature they were trying to attack in this made-up scenario.
And by
I
small
said,
marking,
okay.
it would be like a red X, like we talked about earlier.
And resident player character would attempt to contact the other party members and say, aim for this, or something of the like. And I thought to myself, as a DM, it's not written anywhere that this would work. But this player is taking almost two whole turns to identify and point out a weak point in this creature's armor or just a creature's weakness. I thought they tried to create something. They tried to combine two spells that normally wouldn't work together. I thought this would probably work. They're gaining insight on the weakness and then they're pointing it out. I said, sure. I'm giving the rest of the party advantage on their attack rolls if they attack that specific part. And that's where we left it. Creativity for combining magical effects of spells in DAD is limitless. You can create your own spells if a spell doesn't fit your liking for your character that you're creating. You can, and for every spell that you see, there are 3 more that are similar to it and entirely different to it. And you can just make almost limitless combinations. So I implore you, go out and try to make an interesting magical combination.
If you impress your DM, that'll go a long way.
Oh, for sure. There's even things such as inspiration you can give out to your players, giving them more bonuses on future rolls for solving a puzzle in a clever way, or just role playing in an excellent fashion, making the game better for everyone else.
That's why I chose a bard. But next episode, we will get into the classes of this game. We felt it better to explain spellcasting first, because if we didn't, we would have to be explaining it as we explain the classes. So
we would have to explain it, 6 times rather than 1 time.
Yeah, not fun. That wouldn't be fun to listen to or to record. So,
oh lord,
we are going to go over the main classes just as we did in the first episode with the main races next time. So, look out for that. Thank you all for listening. This has been Discussions of Dragons.